course, not everyone who employs the tools of logic to analyze Nagarjuna will agree with this interpretation. Tom Tillemans, in the same volume, resists this reading and supplies his own analysis of the logical structures implied by Nagarjuna's negations. But my point in exploring Jay's and Graham's use of logic here is not primarily to decide whether they have got Nagarjunian logic right. Rather, what I want to point out first of all is that despite the use, or perhaps because of, but despite the use of the tools of modern logic and analytic philosophy, Jay does remain concerned with the question of personal transformation in his reading or readings of Nagarjuna. The invocation of the mountains are just mountains dialectic is good evidence for this, as is the introduction of the famous ox herding pictures in the same article. As Jay and Graham explain, the third moment of the dialectic differs from the first just in that the realization of emptiness that meditates them strips away the imputation of inherent existence from the apprehension of the conventional, leaving the conventional just as conventional and transforming the world as seen through primal ignorance into the world as seen through awakened awareness. Now, if this is Jay's perspective, then he may not be so far from Sandy. For it seems to me that both Sandy and Jay read Nagarjuna as employing tricks designed to lead to the relinquishing of views, where views refer to ways of engaging in the world that seek to grasp what is in fact ungraspable. For Jay, the tricks are those of logic and rationality. For Sandy, the tricks are those of language and literature. But both portray Nagarjuna as a great magician, capable of luring us into giving up what we cherish most, our conviction that we are right. Or not. For it seems to me that we continue to grasp quite tightly to our convictions, and that even copious amounts of Madhyamaka study may not loosen the hold that our views have upon us. In the time that remains, I would like to consider some of the reasons why this may be, and to think about what we can do collectively to move our study of Madhyamaka forward in the most fruitful and hopefully liberating ways possible. Many of our problems in reading Nagarjuna and the Madhyamaka tradition more generally come, I believe, from a series of fundamental confusions concerning the very nature of our enterprises. Generally, of course, I think we all agree that we're after understanding, and we agree that such understanding cannot be attained in a pristine manner that dispenses with our own prejudgments and subterranean desires. But where do we go from here? In an earlier article, also written with Graham Priest, Jay and his co-author explained their methodology as follows. We do not claim that Nagarjuna himself had explicit views about logic or about the limits of thought. We do, however, think that if he did, he had the views we are about to sketch. This is hence not textual history, but rational reconstruction. The notion of rational reconstruction has begun to gain ground. Dan Arnold explores this idea in his book, Buddhist Brahmins and Belief. There he describes the rational reconstruction of South Asian philosophical texts as a strategy for interpretation that springs in the first instance from a principle of charity, such that, quote, when trying to understand someone, we attribute the best possible arguments to that person, and accordingly assume that apparent failures in sense or coherence reflect our own failure to understand, rather than the failings on his, i.e. the author's, part. To achieve this goal, it is both helpful and appropriate to make use of philosophical insights and ideas that may be entirely foreign to the author's original milieu. Doing so allows one to arrive at a philosophically viable reconstruction of the author's ideas, and also brings the author's ideas into dialogue with current philosophical debates. The twofold advantage is that one gets a new understanding of the earlier thinker, and one gets some new ideas as grist for the contemporary philosophical mill. That rational reconstruction is a philosophical project should be clear, but its practice does beg some questions. Many of these questions have to do with the approach to Nagarjuna that Jay and Graham specifically disavow as their own, namely that of textual history. Even if Jay and others who engage in rational reconstruction of Indian thinkers are not particularly interested in historical issues, they nonetheless still have to admit that their choices to read Nagarjuna, for example, as a philosopher, already embeds within it an historical interpretation. For it includes the judgment that Nagarjuna is, in fact, a philosopher. Otherwise, if Jay and others did not assume that Nagarjuna was a philosopher, then Jay would relinquish the idea of rational reconstruction, along with any concern of what views Nagarjuna would have or could have held. Instead, he would be content to do, as others have claimed to do, some kind of fusion philosophy, in which philosophical problems are made central and various thinkers, including ancient Asian ones, are brought to bear upon them. The question, therefore, is not whether we can read Nagarjuna as a philosopher, as editors of Pointing at the Moon eloquently observe, many of us already do. Philosophy increasingly is global, and Nagarjuna, like it or not, is in the fray. The question, however, is what the cost of doing so may be. In other words, what is lost when we choose to read Nagarjuna as a philosopher and to construct his project as one of philosophy and our own project as one of rational reconstruction? Much, of course, depends on what we mean by philosophy. This is obviously not a simple question. I won't try to answer it here. But I think it is worth considering the ways in which our assumptions about what constitutes philosophy structure our reading of Nagarjuna when we choose to read him as a philosopher, as many of us do. The problem is that our particular understanding of philosophy may not actually line up all that well with what Nagarjuna is doing. And since both Jay and Sandy, and I suspect most of us, do profess to be interested in what Nagarjuna is actually doing, I think that we have no choice but to consider the ways in which our conception of philosophy does or does not correspond to Nagarjuna's own project. To begin to address this, then, I want to suggest that we may need to engage in a kind of ethnography of reading in relation to Nagarjuna's work. I borrow this idea from Daniel Boyarin, who advocates for an ethnography of reading in relation to the Hebrew Bible, arguing that such an ethnography can go some way in addressing contemporary controversies in biblical interpretation. Basically, Boyarin suggests that before deciding how we should read the Bible of ancient Israel, i.e., whether we should read it as historiography or as literature, we need first to, quote, situate reading in its socio-cultural semantic field. He suggests that we do this both in terms of the reading practices of ancient Israelites and in terms of the reading practices of the modern West. To accomplish this project, Boyarin takes a twofold tack. First, he considers the semantic range for terms for reading in ancient Hebrew and considers the affinities and differences from modern terms for reading. Second, to corroborate his findings in the semantic field, he examines biblical and modern narratives that feature scenes of reading. The result of this study is to show that reading for the ancient Israelites had almost nothing in common with the practices of modern reading. I won't detail for you the differences that he sees, but they're significant. The upshot of this is not that we should attempt to return to the reading practices of the ancient Israelites if we wish to understand the Hebrew Bible. That is impossible. Instead, the upshot is that we understand that we are constrained to read the text in ways that make sense to us, according to our modern reading practices. Boyarin argues for reading the Bible as literature and against reading it as historiography, but he does so entirely on the grounds of how the text appears to us now, and not on the grounds of how the ancient Israelites read it. The benefit of his ethnographic study of ancient reading practice is not that we can come to read the Bible the way the ancients did, but rather that we can come to appreciate the ways in which our own ways of reading would actually be unrecognizable as reading to the ancient Jews. The advantage also is that it recasts the terms of the debate. Rather than talking about what the biblical narrative is or is not, he says we should be talking about strategies and pragmatics of reading in different cultural contexts. I think that we need to consider doing something similar for the practice of reading what we call Buddhist philosophy in India. Once we have a better understanding of how the ancient Buddhists might have read or otherwise engaged with Nagarjuna's work, then we can more clearly see the disjunction that such practices may have with our own practices of reading Nagarjuna's writings, either as literary works or as works of philosophy. So just one thing I didn't mention yet, another advantage of the ethnography of reading is that even though we're not trying to understand how ancient people read in order to read like them, our reading, according to our modern reading practices, can become more nuanced, more subtle, and more insightful when we have as a background an understanding of how people were reading at the time. In other words, understanding the semantic field of terms of reading and interpretation and so on allows us to be better interpreters in our own milieu. So an ethnography of reading in Indian Buddhist philosophy faces as its first stumbling block the lack of any Indian term that maps easily to our term philosophy. Boyarin was at an advantage here because there are terms that can map reading in ancient Hebrew and important terms. To move forward, therefore, we would have to isolate elements of the philosophical project and attempt to do an ethnography of those particular practices. My suggestion would be to begin with the practices of learning or study, analysis, argument, and composition. We would also need to consider other attendant practices that we perhaps do not usually identify with philosophy in the West, but which are considered crucial to the success of the more obviously philosophical practices in ancient India. Such practices would include things like memorization, meditation, supplication to a deity, devotion to a teacher, and so on. The ethnography then would proceed on two fronts. We would attempt to discover the semantic range for terms that correspond to our English terms for the practices we have isolated, to see whether and how they overlap with our terms, and we would also examine narrative accounts in which such activities are depicted. That intellectual historian Dominique Lecapra identifies as fruitful for understanding of difficult texts. Those are intentions, motivations, society, culture, the author's corpus, and the structures or modes of discourses of the texts in question. Of course, as Lecapra reminds us, these contexts are not given to us, but rather are themselves texts that require to be read. So it's a complex project. But an exploration of these contexts can help us to trouble our perceptions of the relationships between texts and contexts so as to challenge our own presuppositions, including presuppositions of what Buddhist philosophy even is. Our goal would be to gain insight into how Nagarjuna's texts both reflect and challenge other extra and intertextual realities, as well as to understand more clearly ancient Buddhist practices of reading and engaging with what look to us like philosophical texts. The areas open to exploration in this kind of study are vast, and it is difficult to predict what we might discover. What would a deeper study of the well-known progression of wisdom arising from study, shruti, reflection, chinta, and meditation, bhavana, reveal to us about the interpenetration of intellectual and spiritual practices? What might we learn from an investigation into the role of memorization of Buddhist texts? Did Buddhist monks inculcate Nagarjuna's stanzas as an aid to non-clinging? Did they use these verses to actively meditate on the emptiness of cause and effect, of mover and moving, of self or the means of knowledge as they went about their daily chores? What role did memorization, study, and debate play in their work toward the state of utter non-grasping? How or did they understand their intellectual engagement with these texts to lead to a state in which it would make phenomenological sense to say that they held no thesis or that they had destroyed all views? I think it is obvious that we have only a dim understanding of the answers to these questions. Greater knowledge is clearly a desideratum. But the reason to seek this knowledge is not so that we can read Madhyamaka texts the way the monks did. For a variety of reasons, this will not be possible. But we can get a better understanding of the semantics of the texts, the literary tropes and images, the rhetorical moves, the motivations and intentions, the extra and intertextuality that runs through the works. And then, when we choose to read these works as philosophy or as literature, we will do so with greater nuance and understanding. For me, this is the most helpful way to invoke intellectual history. Sandy and Jay both make use of intellectual history, but they do so in less helpful ways. Sandy attempts an archaeological expose of the history of Buddhist and Western interpretations of Madhyamaka. While not inherently misguided as a project, his sweeping statements do not give enough space for specificity, lumping nearly everyone except Chandrakirti into the camp of wrong-headed rationalists. This detracts from what could be the best part of his work, a careful study of Nagarjuna or Chandrakirti that would highlight the rhetorical, poetic, and literary strategies that work to loosen the bonds of addiction to certainty. Jay is less obviously embroiled in projects of intellectual history. Yet his practice of reading Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti as philosophers committed to rational discourse risks filtering out and ignoring elements of their work that do not fit into the modern model of philosophical discourse. He thus does not so much invoke intellectual history as willfully ignore it. Again, this detracts from his project by making him appear naive concerning the religious and practice-oriented elements of these thinkers' works. His insistence that what he is doing is rational reconstruction may answer what Nagarjuna would think if given the tools of modern logic, but it does not answer the question of what Nagarjuna would do. Nor does it answer what he would make of what we are doing when we read him in this way. Jay thus should consider a concomitant program of practical reconstruction to go along with his study of Nagarjuna's rational discourse as a way of acknowledging that ancient Buddhist philosophy involves practices that are radically different from those with which we engage in the practice of philosophy in a modern West. And I do think that if Nagarjuna would come here and see the way we study Nagarjuna, he would likely say, these guys are clearly lacking in merit. Again, I am not arguing that we need to read like a traditional Buddhist monk in order to read Nagarjuna well. Indeed, I do not think it's possible for us to fully know, much less emulate, those ways of reading. But I think, as Jan Westerhoff has indicated in his recent, very excellent philosophical introduction to Nagarjuna, if our way of reading Nagarjuna does not produce a degree of epistemic humility, then we can be pretty sure we have missed one of Nagarjuna's more important points. What I hope to have shown is that it may be possible to increase our epistemic humility, to reduce our addiction to certainty, and to expose our subterranean desires for being right when we choose to read Nagarjuna, philosophically or in terms of his literary effects. And this is true even though neither method corresponds to what the Buddhist monks of Nagarjuna's day were likely doing when they read his texts. Perhaps then, if there is a Madhyamaka trick, it is this, that there can be multiple ways to engage with Nagarjuna that will bring us some way along the road to a reduction in our fixation on certainty and on the unassailable status of our own conclusions, or at least, so I hope. Thanks.